Hi there, this is Philip from Beyond the Tabletop. In this video I'm showing you how to make an improved flying stand and base for a Forgeworld flyer. In particular I'm doing this for the Forgeworld Marauder Bomber, however you could use it for any of the Forgeworld super heavy flyers. It can also work for any of the Games Workshop plastic flyers if you just want to improve their stability. For the first part of the video I'll be showing you how to create the stand and the base. For the second half of the video I'll be showing you how I decorate it. The key essentials that we need are in front of us. There will be some extras that we need as we go along, so we can worry about those as we get to it. The main thing you'll need is one of the larger Games Workshop bases. This one is the 160mm round base, which I think will give the most stability for such a large flyer. If I bring in the original flyer base for a second, you can see how much smaller it is, and that oval base just decreases the stability even further. The acrylic rod forms the flying stand, and it is 300mm in length and 20mm in diameter. You should be able to easily get this from Amazon or eBay, and you can get some smaller sizes from places like Green Stuff World. Now, in terms of mounting the stand to the base and the stand to the flyer, I'm actually going to be using some large excess resin blocks. Hopefully you should have two decent sized blocks from the Marauder Bomber kit, or from any other kits that you might have built if you've kept them lying around, because they are quite useful to have. If you don't have any of these blocks lying around, then it's probably best to just buy a wooden block and cut it to size. I'm just using these resin blocks because I've got them to hand and will be perfect for the job. Then in terms of gluing them, we've got some epoxy resin because we want to make sure we do a really strong bond between the base and the resin blocks. We've also got some glue and some rod that we can use for pinning. Lastly, we've got something called liquid gravity, which is small weighted balls which are used to weight the base at the very end. It's from a company called Deluxe Materials. You'll also need their Rocket Hot, which is a super thin super glue. First of all, let's look at the two mounting pieces which are made of resin. I had an assortment of resin blocks and I just found the two that was most suitable. One needs to be small enough to fit in the Bombay hatch, which is going to be this one, and then this one is going to mount on the base. You need to drill a hole that's the exact same measurement as your acrylic rod. Now that should be 20mm across. However, when measuring the rod with a caliper, I did notice that the rod was ever so slightly over by a few fractions of a millimetre, which will make a difference. Now to drill these out, I did need to use a proper drilling machine and work my way up through various sizes of drill, starting off with a small pilot drill and then working my way up to the full 20mm drill. Once that was drilled out though, I could test it out, and as you can hear, it's quite a snug fit to get it to fit in all the way, which is perfect for mounting it to the flyer because the rod does need to be detachable for transport purposes. However, this piece of rod I want to actually glue to the base, so this is nice and stable. When I was drilling out this hole, the drill bit wasn't quite locked down and had a bit of a wobble, so the size of this hole is slightly larger, which if I just add it in, you can see that it is quite loose by about a millimetre or so. Now while I could have drilled out another bit of resin, none were quite as large, and this piece isn't that high, so you wouldn't necessarily get much stability. So instead what I decided to do was get some copper tubing. This is 20mm on the inside, so it's the perfect size for the acrylic rod, and obviously slightly larger on the outside, so will actually fit in quite snugly. Now it's a little bit on the loose side, but I can actually glue that in, and then that will be really stable. So once that's on the base, I could drop in this acrylic rod, which is a reasonably tight squeeze, and with all of those bits glued together, that should give me a really stable stand. Just be aware, if you are using something like a metal sleeve, you will slightly scratch up your acrylic rod, but that shouldn't be visible once it's all glued in together. The next step is to find the centre of the base. It's quite clear on the underside where the centre is, so you can just draw a small hole all the way through, which you can just see here. By drilling in that hole, that gives me my visible centre point for when I need to line everything up. One thing to note, that this flyer will be quite heavy and these bases aren't solid, so they will dip down in the centre. At the moment it bends just a tiny amount, but not very much, and that's because I've added in some plasticard in the centre. If I flip it over, you can see I've added some plasticard that is 2mm thick, which should be the same thickness of this lip here. However, what I've noticed is it still wobbles just a little bit, And if I show you sideways, you can see that the stand is actually slightly distorted and not perfectly flat, so that's going to be causing that issue. Now what I could do is add in some extra plastic card until it doesn't move at all. However, I'm going to leave that until later. So the first thing I need to do is glue this piece down into the middle. I've got my center line just there, and it needs to be glued in just there. One thing you need to do is make sure this piece is level both this way and this way, because you don't want the rod tilting at all. You also need to make sure that this side is scored up nicely, which will help with the glue bonding to it. If you're unable to drill such a large hole, instead you could take some smaller blocks and use it to hold the acrylic rod in place. So instead of this hole, you could just have a block here, a block here, a block here, and a block here, and that should hold the acrylic rod in place. When it comes to gluing this piece down, it's important not to use regular super glue or CA glue. Instead, you want to use epoxy resin because that will give a much stronger bond. Otherwise, this piece could snap off quite easily. So I'm going to go away off camera and just glue that piece down. Having left that fully to cure, it took around 30 minutes for the epoxy resin to set. However, it's now the next day because I wanted to let it fully cure. It's now really stable and fixed in place, as well as gluing in the copper tubing to secure everything in place. So I can drop in the acrylic rod. Now it's a really snug fit and I can actually lift it up without the base coming off. So I'm almost tempted to not glue this in because it will make transporting the base so much more easier, but I'll make that decision at the very end because I want this piece to be removable just so it doesn't get any paint on while I'm doing the rest of the base. The next step is to glue in the mounting for the bomber. I've already glued mine in. Before I glued it in, I did a test with the bomber on the stand just to try and find the centre of gravity for the bomber, just to make sure it's not tipping too far forwards or too far backwards. I found the centre of gravity more towards the back of the plane, so I just cut a piece off my block just to help shift the mounting closer towards the middle. Originally my piece was nice and flush with this right hand side edge along with this top, and then I let the model stand on end like this while it set. And unfortunately, when I went away for a few minutes, it's dropped down ever so slightly and now set in place. By the time I came back, it had fully cured, even though it had been less than 15 minutes. So slightly annoyingly, I haven't been able to position that exactly perfectly. So it doesn't look as neat as it should be. However, the model still balances perfectly on the rod, which is the main thing. The fit here is really nice and snug, so I can just drop in that rod. And in fact, I can even hold it upside down just to show you how tight it is. So that piece will be held nice and secure in place. So the next step with the base was just to pin this block in place. Even though the epoxy resin will keep it really secure, I just wanted to add in an extra layer of support. To do this, I used this steel spring wire, 1.2mm wide, and just cut it to length. I then drilled a hole through the bottom, fed it through to the resin, and then bent it around at a right angle going along the bottom of the base. If we flip it over, you can see where the steel rod is drilled into the resin at these points just here. I then bent it at 90-degree angles so the rod runs all the way across along the base and then glued it in place. So that helps secure this rod to the resin. That's just another extra layer of support for the base. Then you can see all this strange black stuff, which is the liquid gravity that I showed you earlier. The liquid gravity is just these small beads that you can pour out over the model, and then with your finger you can just sort of get it as smooth as possible. And then when you've got the right amount, you just need to add the Rocket Hot. Now this is super thin super glue, and that will drip down and glue everything in place. And in fact, it took no time at all for this to set, and in doing so it's now made the base much more rigid, so it won't really flex at all now, making it a much more solid base than it would be otherwise. It's also added a nice amount of weight to the base, which is just what we want. With the base finished to the point where we can start putting everything together, let's now add in the acrylic rod, which I can just drop in here. And then if we just add this in to the point where it's nice and tight. As you can see, the flying stand is quite high, so I've had to zoom out quite far to try and fit everything into frame. It fits together really well and is pretty stable. The stand is also nice and high enough that your plane won't interfere with any other models, vehicles or flyers, and should be tall enough to pass over even quite large scenery, so will be more practical from a gaming standpoint. And if I show you now, the rod is relatively stable when picking it up and moving it around. So if you have a few nudges on the model, you can see here that it is not going to fall over, which is exactly what we want. So there we have it. That is the basics of creating a super heavy flying stand. So while this stand has been specifically designed for a Forgeworld resin flyer, you can also use this technique on the regular Games Workshop flyers if you just want to swap out the flying stand for something that looks aesthetically a bit more pleasing. The second half of this video is just covering how to decorate the base. Now we've got this rather large ugly lump of resin as well as the copper tube, and I now need to hide this. So the plan was to create a small rocky hill which will enclose and hide all of this detail. To do that, I've got some cork bark pieces. Now this is excellent material for creating a natural rocky surface and is used quite a lot by traditional scenic model makers and train hobbyists. Now the cork bark that I've got is the Jarvis Countryside Scenics, and I picked mine up from Scale Model Shop. The link will be in the description below. Cork bark is often used in the pet insect world as well, so you can pick up much larger cork bark by searching on Amazon or eBay. However, those tend to be a bit too large and a bit impractical for the scale that we're working at. However, that is the cheapest amount of quantity for the price that you can get. As I said, I picked up a couple of packets. Each packet gives you a decent sized bit of cork bark, and what I've done is I've just broken it down into smaller pieces, and then I can just place this all the way around to create my rocky outcrop. What I can do is keep adding in the rock, just doing a rough dry fit until I'm happy with everything, and then I can go in with some PVA glue and glue everything together. Now I won't do a step by step, and instead I'll just go ahead and show you the finished result. I've gone away and I've built the rock. As you can see, it's quite large. The rock itself is just those various bits of cork bark, and then to fill in any of the gaps I used some household filler. So if I just rotate it around, you can see what the finished result looks like. In terms of the construction, I built up all the bark bits first using a mix of Gorilla Gel Glue, which is really good for sticking down large bits, but also a mix of that Rocket Hot Glue, which has really good capillary actions. It would allow you to pour the glue down some gaps and the glue would go everywhere, and then it would set really quickly. With the rock face built, I then sprayed it all over with a mixture of PVA glue and water. Now that soaks into the cork bark and actually makes it quite strong once it's dried, and I did that a couple of times and it makes it a lot less squishy than it used to be. That actually makes it a much stronger material, which is good for when you're handling it, but also it makes it better for painting on. Now I did 2 coats of that PVA watered down mix and using a brush to soak up any excess. In terms of the spray, I just used a spare cleaner bottle that has one of those nozzles and triggers, so that makes it quite easy for spraying all over. Otherwise you could just use a large brush to apply it all over. Once that was dry, I then applied that household filler into all the gaps, and at the moment that's just still drying. To fill in the gaps of the bark to make the rock look more like one piece, I've used household powder filler, which is the sort of thing you would use to fill in cracks in your wall. That's just a white powder mixed with a watered down PVA rather than just straight water, because I find that that creates a much stronger bond. When it came to adding in the filler, I just tried to fill in all the gaps that I think needed it. Then I dried it quickly with my heat gun just for a minute or so, but before it had fully set, I then went over all the filler with a dry brush just to stipple the filler to give it a much more textured look, because otherwise that household filler could end up looking quite smooth. So if I show you up close, you can sort of see how the filler works with the cork bark, and that you get a decent blend and it makes it look like one solid piece of rock. And once this is all dry, I can get around to painting it up. To do that, I'll just use a combination of my airbrush along with some dry brush techniques. In terms of the build, that's everything that you need to know. However, in a moment I'll show you what the finished painted base all looks like. Here is the base all painted up. I'll just give you a quick 360 look all the way around so you can see what it looks like. In terms of how I painted it up, I primed everything black and then I did a base colour of Rhinoxide. Now I did that all over, both on the base and on the rock. Now when I sprayed on the rock, what I made sure is with my airbrush was to spray downwards to create effectively a zenithal highlight, which would mean a lot of the recessed areas still stay black, which would create a lot of natural shadowing. I then repeated that effect with Mornfang Brown, doing a very light spray on the rock, making sure I didn't do it too much. I then applied the Mornfang Brown to the base, and then creating a nice blend with the bottom of the rock, so it looked like some sand was going up it. Then for the rock, I did a very light dry brush of Steel Legion Drab, just to pick out some of those areas. And then I followed that up with a further dry brush highlight of Abshanti Bone. The last thing I did for the rock was create a glaze made of Fugan Orange, so I just mixed this down with some Lamian Medium and I applied several coats all over the rock, making sure that each layer had dried before applying the next. This just tinges the rock slightly more red, which makes it fit in with the desert scheme a little bit better, as well as helping blend all of those highlights together. Then I airbrushed on some XV88 along the rim. For the base, I did two different types of texture paint. The first one was Agrellan Badland, which is quite a thick, clumpy look, and I applied this mostly on the edges, joining up to the rock, and in a few other areas just dotted around. And then everywhere else on all of the flat areas, I did Agrellan Earth, which gives you that really good cracked effect, which you can just see over here. By applying more of Agrellan Earth, you can get really large cracks, which you can see here and here. And then where the texture paint is thinner, you get these tiny cracks, which you can just see all the way along here. So you want to create a nice variation all along the base, so it looks quite natural. Now at this stage I did a gloss varnish to protect everything on the model. I use Liquitex Professional Gloss Medium. This just helps protect everything, especially the cork bark, from chipping from general wear and tear, as well as those larger cracks on the base from just coming off. So with the model now being quite glossy, you then need to matte the model back down to its correct state. So for this I just hit it with some Lamian Medium through my airbrush. Now the last thing I did was add in some weathering powder. This is just to help create a bit more of a dusty desert feel, but it also blends the transition between the rock and the desert a bit better, because now you can see you've got some of the sand built up in the crevices along the bottom of the rock. Now I didn't have any weathering powders that matched the colour of the Agrellan Earth. The closest one I had was this Airfield Dust by Ammo. It's a slightly lighter colour, but I think that works really well because it again helps add some variation to the base. This is just a fine powder, so I just brushed it along quite liberally along the bottom. Then I just took the pigment fixer, which I just loaded into a brush, and then dabbed that brush all over, which would then sort of pool out, soaking into the powder and fixing it in place. And there we have it, that is the base all completed. As I mentioned before, I've got an acrylic rod to go inside, which you'll see a bit more on the finished model. That's all for now. If you watch regularly and enjoy these videos, please consider supporting me over on Patreon. Any support is greatly appreciated and it allows me to spend more time making these videos, as they're quite time consuming to put together. If you'd like to support me, the link is in the description below. All my content is free and not behind a paywall, but I've included a few benefits just for my patrons. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to my current patrons. I really appreciate all of your support. You can also check out my online store where I sell resin conversion kits over at beyondthetabletop.com/shop, and my Patreon supporters get a special discount on there too. Lastly, I just want to say thanks again for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it and made it this far, please give it a like and share it with your friends. If you want to keep notified about future videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, and over on the Lookout Sir 40k podcast. That's all for now. Until the next time, take care.